Everyone, welcome to the Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Jennifer Entwistle, and I'm the co-director of the festival, and I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We're so happy to be able to bring you these events online. I want to thank A Mighty Blaze for partnering with us and live streaming some of our events on Facebook today. We're using the webinar version of Zoom, so we cannot see or hear the audience, but you can make any comments during the discussion in the chat window. And we ask that when you have questions for the author that you submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. This event is about 30 minutes long, and so when we get to about the 20-minute mark, I'll be moderating the questions with Tom, so please submit them at any time and we'll start addressing them towards the end of the session. I also want to make a comment that I will be putting into the chat window some links to our partner bookstores, Jabberwocky and the Bookshop of Beverly Farms. So we encourage you to buy your to buy your books from our independent booksellers. And with that, I would like to introduce Tom Schwanda. He is an emeritus professor of Christian spirituality at Wheaton College. As a church historian and spiritual theologian, he teaches and writes about the spiritual lives of the 18th century evangelicals and 17th century Puritans. Tom frequently speaks on various aspects of the life and ministry of George Whitefield, who is buried under the pulpit of the Old South Presbyterian Church here in Newburyport. His acclaimed book, The Emergence of Evangelical Spirituality, The Age of Edwards, Newton, and Whitefield, is part of the highly respected classics of Western spirituality published by Paulist Press. Tom is currently writing a new biography of George Whitefield. Welcome, Tom Schwanda.
Thank you very much, Jen. And thank you to the Newbury Literary Festival for inviting me to this occasion. It's a wonderful opportunity to join you. I've been spending quite a few years working with George Whitefield, and I'm excited to share some things about him in the time that we have today. Some of you might be asking, well, who was George Whitefield? He was born in 1714 in Gloucester, England, not Gloucester, New England, but Gloucester, England. He was a British Anglican minister who preached over 18,000 sermons in just 34 years. He was known for his captivating preaching and for his ability to weave the biblical narratives and the imagery of Scripture together in such a way as to invite people to understand and to know Jesus and to grow in their relationship with him and one another. Many people think of John and Charles Wesley as the fathers of Methodism, but in reality, George Whitefield was the father of Methodism. For in the 18th century, the word Methodist was synonymous for evangelical. And unlike today, where that term has become convoluted and distorted through political and other expressions, back in the 18th century, an evangelical was someone who believed in the good news of Jesus, someone who embraced that to live to the fullest of their life as Jesus Christ sought to live in and through them. So George Whitefield was really the founder of Methodism as well. Now, in the time that we have today, I would like to share three things in particular that are part of the book that might be illuminating for us. The first is George Whitefield as a friend. The second is George Whitefield as a philanthropist and educator. And then third, George Whitefield as a physician of the soul. George Whitefield was a friend to many. He was a friend to the people of Newburyport, Massachusetts. He first preached in your town on September 30th, 1740, during a blinding snowstorm. That's right, September 30th, a snowstorm. Only those from New England would appreciate that. At that point, the church was on the old church was in the Market Square, and the Reverend John Lowell was the minister. In 1746, Whitefield actually organized a church in Newburyport that was the Presbyterian church that was often called, as the name would not surprise us, the Whitefield Church. He was able to encourage the church to bring his friend, Reverend Jonathan Parsons from Connecticut, to be the pastor. And it was on September 30th, 1770, exactly 30 years to the date, that Whitefield preached his last sermon from the window of Jonathan Parsons' house. He shortly thereafter died of asthma. He had made a request that if he died on this side of the pond, that he would be buried underneath the pulpit of the Old South Church. And that's where he is to this day. But George Whitefield had many other friends, and one name that perhaps would be more well known to most of us is that of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was the publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, and he had a policy that he would not publish things unless he knew they were accurate. That's quite unusual for publishing today, isn't it? And so his decision was to determine whether or not these comments that he'd heard that this preacher, this George Whitefield, was able to speak to 10 or 15 or even 20,000 people. Being a good scientist, Franklin actually went when he was preaching his first sermon in Philadelphia, and he actually charted out the terrain, and to his amazement, he determined that George Whitefield could preach to 30,000 people outside. The resonance and the quality of his voice and the compelling nature of the people to listen certainly encouraged that. There's another story that tells us even more about Whitefield's ability to preach. Ben Franklin mentioned that he was going to go to hear him. And as he's writing this in his autobiography, he said he knew that Whitefield would take a collection for the orphanage that he was developing in Georgia. And he resolved not to make a donation. But when he put his hand in the pocket, he found out that, he had 5 gold coins, some silver dollars, and a handful of copper coins. And as he listened and as Whitefield continued to preach, he was more and more moved. So before long, that handful of copper coins was put in the collection plate. After that, Whitefield was very careful not to put his hands in his pocket so as not to bring out the silver or the gold coins. But by the end of that message, he had given everything he had in his pockets. Now, that should not in any way suggest that Whitefield was manipulative or any way subversive in his preaching, but he did have the ability, some God-given gifts of speaking with such a quality voice, as well as his childhood passion of being an actor and being able to hone those events together. Whitefield was also a friend of the American colonies. As time went on, he more and more sided with the Americans rather than his homeland of Britain. He was able to help with the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1765. And as Britain became more and more seeking to control America after the 1760s, Whitefield sought to resist that and to encourage the Americans in their own freedom. So he spoke a message of freedom, freedom politically from the British Crown, but also freedom spiritually to have new life in Jesus. George Whitefield was also a philanthropist and an educator. Something that was quite popular at this time was called the charity school. The charity schools were developed to provide education for poor children, to teach them how to read, and also the basic principles of the Christian faith. And time and time again, Whitefield was preaching these charity sermons, collecting for those schools. And some might suggest that those early charity sermons were a forerunner to the GoFundMe page. Perhaps so. While there were many different institutions that he helped to found in the British nation, I will speak only about those that were here in the American colonies. The first was the University of Pennsylvania. Many people think that Benjamin Franklin was the founder of University of Penn, but if you check the actual history, you will see that George Whitefield was one of the original trustees at the same time with Franklin. They developed a large building that was a charity school during the week for children, and on the weekends, Whitefield and others could preach. And over time, it developed into the University of Pennsylvania. In 1914, on the 200th anniversary of George's birthday, the Methodist alumni of the University of Pennsylvania began the project of creating a statue that stands there in the campus as a commemoration to George Whitefield. Another school that was very dear to George Whitefield was the Log College. Not a very prestigious name, but over time it developed and became more and more important. It was the first institution for training people as ministers in the Presbyterian Church. And over time, as Whitefield continued to support and do fundraising, it eventually became Princeton University. Not Princeton Seminary, that came later, but Princeton University. The final school was Bethesda. This was the orphanage that George Whitefield was developing in Georgia, again, providing for those less fortunate. His desire was to create a school in the South that could somehow be comparable to the institutions such as Harvard and Yale in the North. And amazingly, this school still exists to this very day. It was the oldest child care institution in America. Now, some of you might be asking, why was Whitefield so interested in education? And if we know something about his early years, we would understand why. George Whitefield was raised in an inn in Gloucester. That was the family business. His father died when he was 2 years old. His mother remarried, and that man was not a good husband or a good business manager. And because of family finances, Whitefield was not able to get an education as other children until someone suggested that he could go to Oxford as a servitor. A servitor was a special class of students who would act as servants for those wealthy class students, and they would just depend upon people like Whitefield for all their needs. So Whitefield got to college. He had to work his way through college, but he recognized the great importance of that education. George Whitefield also demonstrates himself as a physician of the soul. This is a term that we might not hear often today, but it was something that was very common to Puritan ministers of the 17th century. Whitefield was constantly being inspired by those earlier ministers. And a physician of the soul or a spiritual director was simply someone who would come alongside a person to help them notice where God was working in their life. A spiritual director or that physician of the soul would help the individual to notice and name boundaries and barriers and to remove those obstacles so that they might be able to grow more fully in their relationship with God and with other people. And so this was something that was very, very key to the life of Whitefield. In many of his letters, he writes saying to people, "I pray that your soul might prosper." And he had a sermon devoted specifically to soul prosperity. In another letter, he talks about being a Boanerges and a Barnabas. Those are two names from the Bible. Boanerges is the name for the sons of thunder, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And the story in the gospel is that as Jesus and the disciples were on the way to Jerusalem, they were passing through Samaria. And as they did, the Samaritans would not allow them to stay because they knew their destination in Jerusalem and there was bad blood between them. When they were not allowed to do that, James and John said, "Jesus, should we call down some lightning to burn them into toast?" And Jesus said, no, don't do that. So the Boanerges, the sons of thunder, were those who would be careful to give warnings or convictions or to help people realize that there were problems. But Barnabas, that means a son of encouragement. He was a person that had a lot of real estate and he sold his property to donate that to those who were poor. And in some ways, whether you are a spiritual director or a physician of the soul or a parent, you know that there are times in which we need to be a Boanerges. We need to sound the note of warning or caution or even conviction to protect our children. And other times when we just take them into our arms and hug them and encourage them and give them that support that they need. Another thing that is so interwoven with this for Whitefield is the idea that he struggled with pride throughout his life. You could probably imagine this. Before he was 22 years of age, he was a rock star of preaching. And you can find so many letters or so many conversations where he says to someone else, "Please don't speak to me about this. I am not the cause. I am only the instrument. Give thanks and praise God, not me." And while pride is perhaps the greatest barrier to spiritual maturity, humility is the greatest means of growing and maturing. over and over again. Whitefield said, "Oh, I ask that I might have a spirit of humility, that I might have a childlike heart, so that I might grow as a little child in the school of Christ." Well, as Jen mentioned, my previous book, the book that I'm working on now, has not been released, but this is The Emergence of Evangelical Spirituality, the Age of Edwards, Newton, and Whitefield. And as the name suggests, it has a number of articles, sermons, entries on George Whitefield. The thing that's important about this book is that it's an anthology. And speaking at the Newbury Literary Festival, it's good to know that virtually every genre of literature is in this. There are sermons, there are hymns, there are letters, there are diaries, there are memoirs, there are prayers, there are worship, liturgical configurations, theological treatises. So not only would you, if you get this, would you find things on George Whitefield, but many other names from New England, if you're from that part of the country. People like Jonathan Edwards, as the name of the book suggests. His students, Joseph Bellamy and Samuel Hopkins. Samuel Hopkins later became the pastor at Newport in Rhode Island, where Sarah Osborne and Susanna Anthony also were members, and very, very influential women. Or Phyllis Wheatley, the first African-American poet. She wrote a well-known poem observing the death of Whitefield. Or Isaac Backus, the Baptist from Rhode Island. So again, The Emergence of Evangelical Spirituality, the Age of Edwards, Newton, and Whitefield. Thank you, and now let's hear from any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you very much, Tom. We do have a few questions coming in. Just as a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions for Tom, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. So the first question is, how was Whitefield received by the other ministers in Newburyport?
Very early on, there was resistance to him. In fact, very early on, there was resistance to him in many places that he went. Part of this was that when, again, he was so young when he started, he reached a point later in life where he actually repented from his indiscretions, his hasty judgments, and his impulsive nature. So during that first wave of preaching when he was in Newburyport, there was a good deal of resistance. By the second time, much of that had been removed because of his greater maturity and ability to speak in ways that would be more appropriate to his listeners.
So what did Whitefield die of, and why do you think Newburyport meant enough to him to be buried here?
He died of asthma. One of the things, if you read his life, you'll notice that he worked incessantly. There are times in which he talks about having preached 7 sermons in a day, or 14 sermons in a short period of time, or the number of miles he has been on a horse, and all these other things. So he was very, very, very active in his ministry. So I think part of that didn't help his health. With time, he became, as the term is used, very corpulent, which is a polite way of saying he was overweight. So that affected the health. Why he wanted to be buried, I think it was just the close association he had. Jonathan Parsons was a friend of his. They had a good relationship. And as I said, after those initial years when he was in Newburyport, he always felt warmly received. And perhaps in some ways it was a second home to him, realizing that he traveled, he made 13 visits back and forth, 13 voyages to America. He made 14 trips to Scotland, a number of visits to Ireland. He even made a trip to the Netherlands. So he was always as an itinerant going here and there. And I think in some ways Newburyport was a home for him.
Let's see. So Andrea asks, could you say something about his role in the Great Awakening and his relationship to Charles Chauncey, the liberal?
Charles Chauncey was not a friend or supporter of Whitefield. And one of the things that was developing as we move into what's called the Great Awakening is that the people who were encouraging this were called the New Lights. They were ones that thought there was needed a new vibrancy, a new vitality to faith. The old lights were those who resisted it. And Chauncey in Boston was one of the primary old lights who took every effort he could to just to bash Whitefield.
Let's see. So what do you think about Whitefield's views on slavery?
We could spend the next few hours on that. It's quite complicated, but let me try to say a few things about that. Whitefield was unusual in that he felt that Black people actually had a soul. There were some people who felt that, Black people, they don't know anything, and there's no reason to preach to them or to give them any type of religious education. And Whitefield always said that a Black person's soul is no different than a white person's soul. And so he was always inviting them. He would sometimes preach just to Black people. He often had what he called his exhortings, which were after the preaching event. He might be in a smaller group, it might be in a home or some other place. And he'll talk about being with, as he would call them, Negroes at that time. And they had a wonderful relationship with them. There was an old woman, Peggy, who you can actually find letters that he's writing back and forth corresponding with this Negro woman. But, and here's the but, the terrible thing is that Whitefield reached a point where he felt that he needed to have slaves in Bethesda in Georgia for the orphanage. And part of the reason for this was that when Georgia was set up as a colony, they outlawed rum drinking and slavery. There was another thing, but I forget that one. But they prevented rum, they prevented slavery. And Whitefield writes this letter to John Wesley in 1751 saying, the climate in Georgia is unbearable in the summer. And he felt that Negroes were better able to handle the climate because of their acclimation to that. And so he basically strongly coerced the trustees to allow slavery in Georgia. So that's not a nice picture at all. When he died, however, some of the people that mourned him the most were African Americans, and they always spoke of him so highly. The other piece to recognize about this question is that in the 18th century, there was a lot of unevenness in thinking about this. John Wesley is often touted as someone who didn't believe in slavery. Interesting thing is he never addressed this until 1772, which was 2 years after Whitefield's death. It was 19 years after the letter that Whitefield sent to Wesley trying to at least justify his reason for doing this. And people like John Newton, who probably many of you would recognize as the author of Amazing Grace, when he became converted, he took 4 more voyages on a slave vessel, including 3 in which he was a captain. And while many of these people might think that slave trade was evil, they thought that slavery as an institution wasn't. And while that seems very convoluted to us, that's a short answer to that very, very important question. The only other thing I would add is that Whitefield, in treating his slaves, he treated them in a way that was respectful and provided for them, and there was not the abuse that you would find if you read something like the narrative of Frederick Douglass. Okay. Hopefully that's helpful. It's a huge issue.
Well, we have a lot more questions. So Jack asks, besides Franklin, which other founding fathers had a relationship with Whitefield?
He certainly had some relationship with John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was a Scots Presbyterian who came over and was the only Presbyterian, the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. So there was certainly that relationship. I don't know of any conversations or any connection that Whitefield would have had with Washington. I do know people like Patrick Henry and others of those sort have written about Whitefield and saying he in some ways helped to give us courage and guidance to our revolutionary causes in America. But beyond that, I really can't give you much of an answer on that, sorry.
Elizabeth asks, do you think it is mere coincidence that William Lloyd Garrison was born in a house between Old South Church and the house where Whitefield died? Might Whitefield's influence have been felt by Garrison or Garrison's mother?
Oh, that's a very good question. It's hard to say. And I think the other part, just to get back to the other question, which relates to this, is if Whitefield had lived another 10 or 15 years, would he have realized the sinful nature of slavery and repented of that? I don't know. And I really, sorry, I can't say much about the Garrison. It certainly is interesting, the proximity in that question. And one of the problems with history is we don't always know some of those answers.
Let's see. Now, did Whitefield ever reside in Newburyport, or was he just a rolling stone? That's from Pat.
He would usually preach 7 to 10 days in locations. And as an itinerant, he would preach a loop, and he would have all these different loops. And one of his practices was he would preach and then return. So let's just say he's in Philadelphia and he's moving his way through New Jersey, up through New York, and then through Connecticut and through Boston. And then he retraces the same steps so that he would, in a sense, be able to check back and to see what progress or questions or concerns might have happened. So, you know, maybe 7, as I said, 7 days or so, but he was, excuse me, never like, he was in Bermuda for about 5 or 6 weeks, never, to my knowledge, that lengthy of a stay.
Okay. Jerry asks, how much information can you glean from his personal letters, and are there any archived at the Old South Church?
You can get a tremendous amount of information from his letters. And right now there is a current project. In fact, 2 friends of mine in England are working on a critical edition of Whitefield's letters. And they have gathered, as far as they can tell, letters that have been all over virtually the world. Some in Germany, a lot in England, quite a few in America, different locations. As far as Newburyport, that's a good question. I'll have to ask Sarah that to see.
Okay.
The other thing I should mention is that, and this is one of the challenges for historians, is that your editors sometimes took some liberty in airbrushing letters to make you look better. But the thing that's important about Whitefield's letters is he doesn't come off good because he's very honest about his own brokenness and struggles and his need to repent. So there's enough of that to give a sense of authenticity to them.
Jan asks, do you have a favorite Whitefield quote?
I would say I have a few favorite Whitefield quotes. So one of the ones that he uses quite often is he talks about having sweet communion with God. It's not just communion, but it's a sweet communion, which speaks of a sense of joy and delight. He uses the phrase, all the world's my parish, which people normally associate with John Wesley. Again, John Wesley said that 3 weeks after Whitefield. Most of the things we think that Wesley did, first of all, he did second. And it's part of the problem is that Whitefield doesn't have the research and the literature that John Wesley have to give a more accurate presentation. Another phrase that he has that's, it's kind of, it has just a nice lilt to it. When he's talking about the preaching or his different visits, he'll say, the word ran and God was glorified. And you'll see that over again. The word ran and God was glorified.
Well, we have more questions here than we can get to, but so I want to end on this one that comes in from Steve Schwanda. So I believe this is a plant of some sort. No, your granddaughter wants to know why his last name was sometimes spelled with an E and other times not. So I think your granddaughter is calling me out on the fact that I said Whitefield at the beginning of this introduction.
Well, Haley, thank you for that question. When you go back in the early writings, you'll see both Whitfield and Whitefield. And when you actually do a Google search, you'll find far more if you take the E out sometimes. So it's something that developed early on, but for Whitefield himself, he used the E in there And for various reasons, some people just said, well, if we're pronouncing it that way, then why don't we get rid of the E to make it better?
Yep.
That's the simple answer to that. Thanks, Haley.
That's a good answer. All right. Well, as I said, there are more questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time and we won't be able to get to them. But thank you so much, Tom Schwanda, for spending your afternoon with us. Thank you to everyone who called in. I just want to mention that we do have more events happening today. So if we hope that we'll see you again this afternoon, participants. But in the meantime, as I mentioned at the beginning of this call, please, we hope that you will purchase your books at Jabberwocky or at one of the other independent bookstores, because we want to help them during this time of quarantine. So, Tom, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.